Dr. Pickles, I'm going to ask you to look now at a document at NHBT 0009861, please. If we go to the second page, this is a document from you dated the 15th of February 1990. There's a specific context about factor 8 supply at that point in time, but my question is more general, and I'm really using this as a springboard for the more general topic. If we look at the last paragraph, paragraph 4, you say there, the department has no intention to restrict the clinical freedom of haemophilia directors. Now, obviously that is within a particular context of the issue there, but you've spoken in your statement, as have others, more generally about the concept of clinical freedom as an established part of the thinking in the 1980s. Why was clinical freedom regarded with such significance, or as being of such significance?
I'm not sure how much my opinion really matters, but I mean, there are eminent people who wrote about it at the time, and I suggest to think of what views of clinical freedom were in the 80s and the 90s is best to look at contemporary descriptions about clinical freedom, because there certainly was discussion about it with not just the prop list, but the whole concept of clinical guidelines and NICE, when that came in, was this going to restrict the clinical freedom of medics? So, I mean, almost my view doesn't matter. It's just well documented for that time period, and I haven't read up on it. So.
No, it's really just trying to get a sense of the department's perspective. Other witnesses have talked about, including departmental witnesses, have talked about this idea of clinical freedom, this idea that doctors had to be left to be free to take their own decisions. And that's sometimes been, it might be said, put forward as a defence or justification for the department not doing more or not issuing guidance. And I wanted to really get a sense of, do you recall discussions about it at the time you were in the department?
I'm not sure I remember specific discussions about clinical freedom in general, but that was being discussed in the medical profession at large at that time. And you could put on both sides of the argument what is only the doctor and the individual patient would know what was best for those circumstances against what the evidence base was suggesting would be appropriate. And indeed, the only real powers that the NHS had to limit what people did in the NHS was through restricting their access to various treatments.
And so then would it be fair to understand that at the time you were in SEB, so 98 to 91, this idea of respecting clinical freedom was still a significant part of the decision-making processes?
Well, it was a given, actually. I'm not sure we would have ever thought of restricting clinical freedom. It's difficult to think of the circumstances for the department to do that.
Can we then just move to a different topic, or perhaps not a different topic in one sense, HCDO 40-271_033. Now, this is a meeting of the AIDS Group of Haemophilia Centre Directors, September 1988. Right. We can see you're in attendance. Does that reflect the fact that you're holding the vacant haematology brief at that time? Now, there isn't one particular part of this document I specifically want to ask you about, but you'll see if we look at the bottom of the page, there's a heading about AZT, and there's a discussion that continues over the page. With the haemophilia doctors talking about the use of AZT. Evidence that this inquiry has heard has suggested that those haemophiliacs who were infected with HIV not all, but a significant number of them were effectively being managed and treated for their HIV by their haemophilia clinician rather than through referral to a specialist service. Do you recall that coming to your mind as an issue or something the department should think about?
It could have done. I have no recollection of that, but you know, I'll revise that if you show me a document.
No, there isn't one. Hence the question.
No, I'm sorry, I don't remember that.
And then, if I can ask you to go back to your witness statement. So, Lawrence, if we can have WITN 6965001. And if we go to page 48. So this was in relation to a question about ministerial responsibilities. If we go to the bottom half of the page, please. You were asked by the inquiry to identify the ministers with whom you had dealings, and you referred to dealings with Mr Fowler, Mr Newton, Lord Skelmersdale in relation to AIDS. And then you've identified who you had dealings with when you were in the Med ISD 3, if you put that. I just wanted to ask you about what you said about Mrs Curry.
Yes.
You said Mrs Curry was also involved in relation to the consequences of infection in haemophiliacs. Do you recall what that was referring
yes,
to?
Yes, I do. It's quite a memorable meeting, actually, because I was not a terribly disciplined civil servant, so I'm afraid I ended up not supposed to argue with ministers. And I had a meeting when I was in the AIDS unit, meeting with Mrs Curry, and I can remember what it was about. It was about infected haemophiliacs, and she was saying they mustn't have sex with their wives. And I said, you can't tell men they can't have sex. You need to explain there are ways of sexual expression that they can have that don't put their partners at risk. And it was quite a ding-dong discussion. And Mr Happel, the Deputy Secretary, was present at the time and was really a bit gobsmacked that we were arguing in this way. So that's what it was about. And I remember it because of the context. And having said that, she said nice things about me in the BSE inquiry, so I can't have been too argumentative.
There's evidence the inquiry's heard previously about an observation that Mrs Curry made about good Christian people won't catch AIDS. And I'm not specifically asking you about that, but really about ministerial attitudes to AIDS. Do you recall, whether through your work on the AIDS unit or your subsequent work in Med-SEB, do you recall anything in particular about ministerial attitudes towards AIDS? Because you had access to a broader range of government departments than just the Department of Health, and whether those changed over time, and if so, how?
Yes, I may need to be reminded by the minutes of HA, of which I think only one set was, or two sets were sent to me. There was quite a very interesting attitude among ministers, and particularly in comparison with the attitude among their permanent secretaries. I mean, Norman Fowler was obviously very engaged, and I think he's given evidence already. Tony Newton was very engaged, but his predecessor, Barney Hayhoe, was much more, I was going to say, a bit more old-school Tory. And the impression I had is that ministers in the Department of Health were having difficulty persuading their cabinet colleagues to have, I would say, a more liberal attitude to AIDS. And certainly within HA, it was apparent that some of the ministers there were very negative, you know, lock them up, lock them away type attitudes. I'm not saying they said that, but it's that they needed a lot of convincing and were convinced. And the ones that led the discussion, not just the Willie Whitelaw, the Deputy PM in the chair, but Geoffrey Howe was very influential in, and I thought very, very wise and ahead of his time. I say it was they were different from their permanent secretaries because the parallel permanent secretary committee was, again, quite a contrast, and they were in effect, defending their departmental positions. So the person for defence or Scotland, whatever, would be very, to my mind, narrow-minded in comparison with their ministers, who were much more broad-minded and took the view of the government and the population as a whole. One of the more difficult ministers was the Secretary of State for Scotland, I remember at that time, but who had a particular problem with injecting drug use. But actually, even the Scots were won over to what appears like a rather funny policy of encouraging, well, giving free needles to drug users, but actually was the right way to deal with the infection. So there's definitely a big range, and we're on a huge learning curve as well.
And then another general question about ministers. In terms of ministerial responsibilities within the Department of Health for blood and blood products, there seems to have been a relatively high turnover of ministers.
Right, so.
And that may reflect government more generally, yes, of course. Yes. Again, in broad terms, what kind of problems did that, or difficulties did that create for civil servants? If you have a minister with responsibility for an issue changing every couple of years?
Well, I can only talk my time in the department. It was entirely a Tory administration, so there wasn't a change of administration, which would be a wholesale change. It was both a difficulty and an opportunity. I mean, you may have some ministers who were not up to speed or not particularly interested, not that I had in these topics we're talking about. And a change of minister might give you an opportunity to have somebody who was easier to engage with. You might say it's the same applied to civil servants. My Minister of Opposite Numbers were also being swapped around about every 3 years or so.
Now, I want to then, in your statement, ask you some, just to clarify a handful of observations that you make in section 36 of your statement. So this begins on page 43, please, Lawrence. You were asked to give an account of decision-making structures within the Department of Health, and I'm not going to ask you about most of it because you've set out a narrative in your statement, but there's a handful of points if you could clarify. Bottom of the page, please. Paragraph 36.3. This is specifically in relation to licensing. You say for blood products that fell under the Medicines Act, quality and safety were considered formally alongside efficacy in the licensing process. And then it's this next bit I wanted to ask you about. With those recommended for licensing regarded as being above an ill-defined line, with importance given to the comparative safety against others that were already licensed. Now, I know that you can't talk knowledgeably about factor concentrates because you weren't involved with the biologicals team, but that more general observation, what do you mean by the ill-defined line?
Well, basically there had to be evidence of quality, safety and efficacy. Quality was dealt with by the pharmacists, and that was essentially each batch did what it said on the tin. Efficacy, it had to be shown to be effective for the indications requested. But how effective was not really ever properly defined. Safety, it had regarded as safe for use, and so to compare one new drug in relation to a previous one against which it might have been tried, if it was less safe, unless there was outstanding evidence of enhanced efficacy, it wouldn't get licensed. So the comparative safety was a very important part of the decision-making. But I say things are ill-defined because what's really ill-defined is the efficacy part of that.
But if I can just pick up in relation to safety.
Yes.
And it may be that this is impossible to answer as a matter of generality, but what was their guidance about safety? What kind of consequences would fail the safety test, and what kind of consequences wouldn't?
I guess, was it written down? No, I don't think so. So a lot of the experienced rule of thumb, it depended also what the conditions were. I'll give an example of the extreme. I know I was responsible for recommending for licensing and was licensed a drug that would be fatal in quite a high proportion of people given at the recommended therapeutic dose. What? Yeah, well, this was a drug for acute leukemia, and it was given for people who, in the circumstances in which it was given, they had in protective isolation, maximum support with blood products and antibiotics and so on. You might say otherwise, how ridiculous that you would license such a drug, but in the circumstances of acute leukemia, the efficacy in dealing with acute leukemia was regarded as acceptable, even for that really grossly unsafe product, and if you looked at safety in isolation. For other products for a more trivial condition, then actually something as minor as skin rashes or transient skin rashes could at least call for discussion with the company about restricting the range of uses for which it was being promoted, or to make sure that the patient safety leaflets were beefed up. Or if necessary, if it was serious enough, we would start a process of formally varying the license or revoking the license. And certainly I was involved with the revocation of a series of product licenses.
And then just in terms of the information that would be given about side effects and or potential adverse consequences, and again, conscious you can't talk about factor concentrates, not having been involved with that, but more generally, how intensely were those, was the leaflets, package inserts, etc., scrutinised?
Yeah. I mean, what was part of the licensing process was the data sheet. So that had to accurately reflect the license indications and the data that we assessed. There were also then, and that's, I think that's all we formally assessed, but somebody kept an eye on the advertisements, which had to be consistent with the advertisements to the public or advertisements to prescribers, and that had to be consistent with the data sheet. I don't think that the advertisements as such would be properly analysed separately by the Medicines Division. I did do that as a student exercise once and got slightly ticked off for doing that.
And then if we go over the page, the top of the next page, you said the most structured decision-making in the field of infection risks was undertaken by the ACDP. So that's the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens. What was it about their decision-making that leads you to characterise it in those terms?
Well, really just because of the way they tabulated the risks and dealt with it formally, and that was done because it was joined with the Health and Safety Executive. It was a formal body that had experts, employee and employer representatives.
And then you've said in, if we go slightly further down the page, paragraph 36.7, you say you don't recall ever seeing all the many risks associated with blood and blood products pulled together and tabulated and assessed formally. Would it have been advantageous, do you think, both for decisions that the department might fall to take or potentially for wider dissemination through professional bodies or so on, if those risks had been tabulated?
I don't know. I'm assuming many of the textbooks at the time might have done that, and it's whether you bring the whole lot together. But I think what was being done was looking at the infection risks and then looking at the delivery risks and then the what happens when you've got blunders and errors in the transfusion practice. I haven't seen the whole lot put together.
You've also then explained later in your statement, I don't think I need to look at any particular passage, that it would be part and parcel of the responsibility of the SMO, whether it's hepatitis or haematology or whatever it might be, they would have to some extent a proactive, or there was an expectation they would have a proactive role. So they wouldn't simply react to information that came into the department. They would be expected to keep on top of developments. And
up to speed with what was happening in the field.
And so if matters came to their attention through articles, attendance at meetings, whatever it might be, they'd be expected to obtain more information and then pass that up through
if
line management if appropriate.
Yeah, exactly.
If we look in
Sorry, and since writing this, I appreciate there's quite a bit about assessment of risks in that volume 15, the BSE inquiry report, and that shows the contemporary views about risk assessment.
If we go to a document at WITN 6965006, please, Lawrence. Now, this is a document that you produced. We can see it's produced for the purposes of EGA, July 86 for information, September 86 for discussion. Presumably the distinction between that is that it was circulated and then it was put on an agenda. Was it for a meeting? Is that the reference for discussion?
Yes, I presume it was that,
yeah. It's entitled, have we considered every possible source of iatrogenic aids and have we taken appropriate action? And I don't need to go through the detail of it with you, but it is a structured assessment.
Well, it's my attempt to sort of make sure that there wasn't any small print that had been overlooked. And I have to say I did something very similar in relation to exposure of humans to BSE material.
And so you've looked at the different mechanisms by which transmission could occur, and then you've asked the question, what steps could be taken to address or reduce transmission through those routes?
Yes.
Now that's something you did whilst at the AIDS unit. Did you ever see anything equivalent in relation to AIDS at an earlier stage within the department?
I mean, this, I don't think I did. That's probably what I would have referred to it if I had been aware of it, put it that way.
And did you ever see anything equivalent or even similar in relation to hepatitis?
No.
And then, can I go back to your witness statement? WITN, I should know it off by heart by now. 6965001. And it's page 46. Paragraph 36.14. This is about sharing information with ministers. And you've said here, sharing progress on such policy matters with ministers was more reactive, depending in part on press and parliamentary interest, but also the need for sign-off of decisions with such financial consequences that they justified separate mention in the annual spending round. It also depended on ministers' personal interests and how busy they were with other areas within their brief. Now, first of all, when you say personal interest, do you mean how interested they were with, say, in AIDS or...
Yes, I think so, but I mean, I can't give you examples, but I think some ministers were more interested in the scientific viewpoint and others more on the patient viewpoint, and others were particularly obsessed with what the Daily Mail was going to be saying.
That really leads on to the next question I wanted to ask you arising out of this. It's really what was the yardstick, the criteria, the factors that would lead to something being flagged up with a minister? You've identified two there, press and parliamentary interest, and then financial consequences. So those might be two factors, is this right, that might lead to the DCMO or the administrative equivalent saying this needs to go to ministers?
Yeah, I mean, these are policy matters as you're developing a policy. Sometimes that has been originated in ministers and they wouldn't necessarily expect to hear anything until it's on its way back for final approval. I don't know, it's difficult. There's so many different examples, and I think it'd be different for the subject matter and indeed the minister and where we were in say, the political cycle.
So is this right? There might be some ministers who
we had some very conscientious ministers for whom wanted detail on everything. I think someone like Stephen Dorrell, he was only a parliamentary under-secretary when I was working there. He lapped up lots of stuff, read it very carefully, was very conscientious. And others were a bit more trusted officials to get on with the business.
And And was that really something civil servants were just...
We'd understand.
Learn through experience.
From experience, but also somebody like Storm Heppel, the Deputy Secretary, was very good at giving a steer as to who needed to know and what level of detail.
And then now on a completely different topic within your statement, please, if we go to page 51, Lawrence. It's paragraph 42.3, and this is just on the topic of Crown immunity. I'm not going to ask you about any of the detail about the ending of Crown immunity, but it's your general observation here. My general view was Crown immunity was an excuse for poor practices and had to go, with non-compliance of state buildings with full fire safety standards a particular personal concern. Did you get any sense of why Crown immunity had lingered for so long?
No, I'm sorry. It's above my pay grade.
And would it be right to interpret from what you say here that you thought Crown immunity contributed towards poor practice, or at least
poor practice could hide behind Crown immunity, and that's certainly, I think, fire safety of state buildings was a very obvious example. I can't remember if at the time there'd been some disasters that had taken place, but it remained a concern of mine for some time.
We can take the statement down. Thank you, Lawrence. I want to ask you next. I think I can do it without reference to any particular document about surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis. And I'm not going to be asking you about the detail of it, but just about decision-making structures. So we know, and I'll look with you at a later stage of your evidence in the course of the day, that once the ACVSB was established, it looked at, obviously, the introduction of screening in relation to hepatitis C, but it also looked to some extent at issues of surrogate testing. Prior to the establishment of the ACVSB or outside of the ACVSB, were you aware of any particular formal mechanism for considering whether surrogate testing should be introduced?
Well, I think the transfusion service would have been thinking about it on their own, and if they felt it was appropriate, then Harold Gunson would have raised it with the department.
So you're absolutely right in the sense that it comes up in regional transfusion director meetings from time to time, and we've had evidence from a number of regional transfusion directors in relation to that. But in terms of the department's decision making, prior to the ACVSB being established, had there been any body that would have been charged with or looking at?
I don't know, but I'm assuming that, I'm sorry, I haven't checked on his evidence. Dr. Roger Moore would have been the key principal at that time. And he would have been in close contact with Harold Gunson and the transfusion field as well. So if they had felt anything was appropriate in terms of investment from the department in that area, I'm sure we would have heard. And he was closer linked in, I think, on that sort of matter than I would have been.
Now, can I move to a topic now in relation to blood transfusion practice? I'm picking up with a minute from Dr. Raymond copied to you. It's NHBT 0000062_030, please. So we have the minute of the 12th of February 1991 to Dr. Metters, copied to you and to Mr. Canavan. We can see from the first paragraph, CMO asked for information regarding topping up with a single unit of blood. And then Dr. Raymond explains he discussed it with Dr. Gunson. Dr. Gunson didn't believe the transfusion service had any information on how frequently it occurred. And it records, Dr. Gunson recording that there had been a few years previously a concerted campaign to try and curtail the practice. And then paragraph 3 Dr. Raymond observes that the CMO is perfectly right in that it is the postpartum situation where this practice has occurred, as well as in general surgery where the surgeon feels his patients do much better to have that little extra. And there's a reference to a publication, which is over the page, but I don't think we need to look at it. And then Dr. Raymond says, I'm not sure whether one way of trying to tackle this particular problem is to suggest that transfusion policy be part of medical audit. Yeah. Now, before we look at a couple of ACVSB meetings where that was then discussed, can you just explain to us what medical audit was at that time?
What was the date again?
This is February 91.
Yeah, this is really very early days for medical audit, and it was a couple of years later then there were substantial audit funds available. And I think some audit was taking place, and I think one of the documents shown me from Marcela Contreras of the audit that she had described about use of blood products. I would just say it was in its infancy, basically.
Now, this issue having been flagged up, it would appear, by the Chief Medical Officer. There are then 2 ACVSB meetings where there's a discussion. The first is PRSE 0002280. So this is an ACVSB meeting of the 25th of February 1991, and we can see that you were in attendance as an observer. If we go to page 10, we can pick it up at the bottom of the page, paragraph 34. Right. The chairman said that the CMO had expressed concern about unnecessary single-unit transfusions. Information on the frequency of this practice was not held centrally. A recent series of articles in the BMJ should have had the effect of discouraging these transfusions, but the committee was invited to consider if further action was required. And then top of the next page, it says, members did not favour a survey. The practice of single-unit donations was widely condemned and should be routinely addressed through medical audit procedures. Now, there's then a later meeting I'll come on to in a moment, but if we just take it in stages. Now, condemnation by the committee of that practice.
No, I mean the profession, and just widely condemned. I think, I don't know if the BMA had said something, but I think you referred earlier to Marcela Contreras' article. I don't think there's any dissent on the leaders of the medical profession as a whole, including surgeons and obstetricians.
So your reading of this, and you may be right, Dr. Pickles, is the committee is saying it's widely condemned within the profession.
Yes.
And then the reference is, so the suggested action is routinely addressed through medical audit procedures. But as you've indicated, that was in its infancy at this time.
Yeah, and the appraisal process.
And then the second discussion, I think during your time at the department, is in the next meeting of the ACVSB on the 21st of May 91. That's NHBT 0000042_080, please, Lawrence. So we've got the date there, 21st of May 1991. You're down as an observer, although someone's handwritten a cross beside your name.
Was that the one that there was one? Oh, anyway, let's see.
It may be. In any event, my question doesn't depend, I think, on whether you were in attendance. If we go to the next page, we can see at paragraph 5 the topic of single-unit transfusions. And it says that the chair reported that since the last meeting, the CMO had asked the Director of Research and Development to consider undertaking a study to establish how widespread the practice of single-unit blood transfusion is. The Royal College of Physicians is preparing a draft protocol for an audit of blood transfusion practice in district hospitals, with particular reference to medical wards. Discussions with departmental officials responsible for medical audit indicate this is a local matter unless colleges decide to take it up. So we can see 3 steps there identified. The first, I think, there is a later study, but it's after you've left, so I'm not going to ask you about that. The second refers to the Royal College of Physicians, and then the third is says a local matter unless colleges decide to take it up. Do you know what it is meant by saying it's a local matter? Does that just mean that
within a hospital medical audit committee?
So, do we understand from that that the department wouldn't then itself be doing anything further?
It reads like that, but I mean, the Director of Research and Development, his study would be reporting to the department.
Do you? I know you then moved on, I think, shortly after this from the Med-SEB role.
Yes, to work for the Director of Research and Development.
Yes. Do you have any recollection now? You may well not, as to whether that came across your desk when you were there.
35 years ago.
No. Do you know whether any consideration was ever given up until this time to the issuing of either a Dear Doctor letter or any other form of guidance from the CMO or the department about transfusion practice generally? I
don't know, but it'd be interesting to see the listing to see if it was covered, because such a wide range of specialties might be involved, it could have been an appropriate topic.
I should say, we do know that later on in the 90s, there were CMO initiatives in relation to transfusion practice. But you've got no recollection now of anything in particular. And then, if we could just look on this topic at one other document, NHBT 0000189_142. So this was a letter to you, May 1990, from Dr. Contreras.
Yes.
It deals with a number of issues, and there's only one I wanted to ask you about. So it's on the second page. I think I can probably pick it up. Well, in the third paragraph on the page talks about education of hospitals to improve the practice of clinical blood transfusion.
Yeah.
And then the next paragraph talks about the work of the North London Blood Transfusion Centre in terms of undergraduate and postgraduate teaching and education. And indeed, Professor Contreras told us about the work that was done.
Example of good practice.
And then the third paragraph talks about establishment of hospital transfusion committees. Again, it may be that you won't be able to recall any particular details, but was this issue about educating clinicians about better transfusion practice and establishment of hospital transfusion committees? Was that something that was essentially left to be dealt with on a local level, as far as you can recall at this time, rather than it being a department initiative, or were you not able to say?
I can't remember a departmental initiative, but Marcella Contreras is very influential, so she may very well have done something through the Royal College of Pathologists, and indeed through them other colleges.
I want to turn next to ask you about your involvement with the HIV haemophilia litigation. Now, you've referred in your statement to a letter you received in May 1988 from the Yorkshire Regional Transfusion Centre, which alerted you to a claim against the Regional Health Authority, and it was being drawn to your attention on the basis there might be a bigger issue here. We don't need to look at it. What you told us in your statement, essentially, in relation to the haemophilia litigation, was that yours was primarily a passive line management role, with Dr. Raymond taking the more active role. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then if we can go back to your witness statement, because there's a particular phrase I wanted to ask you about. So WITN 6965001. And it's page 82. Paragraph 77.3, you say, you refer to acting as a passive line manager to Dr. Raymond, who was heavily involved and represented very well the interests of the branch. What do you mean by that? What was the branch you're referring to, and what were those interests?
The medical input to the litigation. So branch, I'm thinking my branch, basically.
And
if I put my instead of the, then yeah.
And when you say the interests of the branch,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that?
I mean, we were, as far as I understand, we were asked to provide medical advice to the administrative team and the lawyers, and we're providing that medical advice. And who better than Dr. Raymond, the haematologist?
And then can I then pick up with you just some of the documents which show those occasions on which you had a slightly more active role? If we start with an issue which I think might pick up upon something which the Chair explored with Dr. Raymond, WITN 6965009. It's a minute from you, 5th of November 1990, to Mr. Powell, who was the solicitor. And we can see it refers to advice from Dr. Raymond and a copy of a minute from Dr. Raymond, which is over the page. What you say in the second paragraph is, I'm most concerned that the point about alternative site testing has not been appreciated. This was the major argument at the time. There's evidence from overseas, Switzerland, for example, that where such sites were not available, infection rates in blood donors were much higher because of selection of high-risk individuals that could not be tested any other way. Now, is it correct that when you say alternative site testing, are you talking there about the idea that there needed to be facilities for testing for HTLV3 in GUM clinics and the like? And
through GP practices and elsewhere, yeah. So if somebody thought they were at risk, they didn't have to go to pretend they were safe and go to a blood donating session to find out if they're infected. They could find out other ways.
And we can pick it up over the page with Dr. Raymond's minute, which I think was, we examined vast numbers of documents with Dr. Raymond, but not, I think, this one. So this is the 1st November 1990 minute that you referred to in yours. And if we pick it up, it's the paragraph numbered 4, where Dr. Raymond has said there, important to point out that in addition to the problem of false positive HIV antibody tests, which led to the need for evaluation of the various tests, another major reason for delaying introduction of screening to the NBTS was the unavailability of the test in genitourinary medicine clinics, and so on.
Yep. A very important point, and
What was the factual basis for your understanding that that was the major argument at the time?
I'm not sure if it was the major argument. It was obviously a very significant argument because I suppose the most major argument was the state of testing. I mean, you couldn't have done it a year earlier. There were no tests. I know I saw what was asked of Dr. Roman yesterday. Did I do a proper review? Was there a document that I can now quote? I'm sorry, there wasn't. When I arrived in the AIDS unit, that was very clearly the perceived wisdom. That must have been in some of the standard briefing we had. I know that it had been a difficult decision because it's one of those where you stop and think, surely, how are you delaying testing? It can't be right. Yes, it wasn't done casually. It was a very careful, considered decision. I'm aware of that. I must have discussed it with people at the time, reassured myself that that had been an active decision, not a default, and that the people who took that decision had been fully engaged with what the consequences were. Now, what I can't do is actually know from what happened in Switzerland, for example. I don't know how well evidenced that was. I suppose some of that information might be still obtainable now, but can I just say in general, I can't speak for what happened before I was in the AIDS unit, but during the time I was in the AIDS unit, my impression was that the policy making in AIDS in the UK was advanced of the rest of the world. And actually, a lot of other nations were looking to us for some of the decisions we made. They were having much greater difficulties, and we found that we had, with our Tory administration about some of these sensitive matters. I cannot believe, knowing the individuals, and it was the same chief medical officer, that the decision about introduction of screening wasn't taken with the same sort of care and due consideration, thinking of all the ramifications in a way potentially they wouldn't have done in other nations, where, not least the fact that if they didn't have a health service, transfusion service was not responsible for the GOM clinics or primary care testing. So I can't evidence it anyway other than that's clearly perceived wisdom. I was satisfied myself when I arrived in the AIDS unit that that is what had happened, and there was no need to challenge it.
And I think we know from contemporaneous documentation that one of the medical officers involved in the process, the decision-making process at the time, was Dr. Smithers.
Yes, that's right. Principal medical.
I think, did I understand your evidence earlier? Dr. Smithers was part of the AIDS unit? Or
No, she was not.
She was not.
No.
But you had.
But she would have been part of that. I mean, she would have done that discussion. But the AIDS unit would have been involved with the alternative sites. So it would have been. And the AIDS, before I arrived, the AIDS unit wasn't really an AIDS unit. It was all within the same. It was within the communicable disease division, I think, but I'm not sure the structures in '83.
Can I then pick up an issue with you by reference to, I think there are possibly two documents I might need to look at with you. The first is...
But just before you do that, this passage in paragraph 4 suggests, indeed, seems to state that it was a reason for delaying screening tests which were,
yes,
by definition, available, that they might be used by individuals at high risk of HIV.
Yes.
Now, that was a reason internal to the department.
Well, yes, and agreed with whoever the advisory bodies were at the time, the EGO and so on.
So, to what extent was it made at all public? You've spoken about how open the AIDS unit was. Was this? I
don't know, but I'd say it probably predates the AIDS unit as such.
Yes.
I don't know how I mean, presumably that can be researched to see how much was said at the time. I don't know.
Yes. Are we aware of any open statement?
You're building on the question you asked previously, sir, during Dr. Raymond's evidence. I'm afraid my answer is still going to be the same. Not off the top of my head, but it's on our list of things to look further at. I
mean, we now have effectively confirmatory evidence that this was part of the approach, and plainly the gap between the availability of a test and its introduction for potentially various processes needs to have some reasonable explanation.
Yes, it's certainly...
I say ought to have some reasonable explanation.
Yes, and
there should be documentation of the decision.
So if I can move then to DHSC 0004365_006. Now, this was a minute from you, 7th of December 1990, to Mr. Dobson, copied to Mr. Powell and to Dr. Raymond. Yeah. This is in the context of a submission that's going to go to ministers in December 1990, and you refer there to an annex which comments on legal advice. And you've said this, we discussed this, my view is that this estimate from the most junior of our council was so insecure that it was misleading to present it to ministers. CMO has now put on record his view, with which we all agree, that there's been no negligence by the central defendants and those advising them. If this council persists in emphasising the chance of losing, then I would expect to see a more detailed explanation. It may be that, like last time, major arguments have been omitted, or more likely the problem is not the legal strength of our case, but how a biased judge might handle it. The correct reaction to such an assessment is to recommend an appeal, if necessary, not a settlement. Now, what I want to do is...
No, just my part, the final...
Oh, yes, sorry. If a settlement is to be reached, there are plenty of other reasons for justification. We do not need to pretend we might lose. I just want to show you a couple of other documents and then ask you about your thinking.
Guess what's coming.
So the reference to the CMO having put on record his view is, I think, probably a reference to DHSC 0046939009. And this is the same date as your minute. CMO has seen, addressed to you, has seen your minute to the 5th of December, so that was an earlier one, and Mr Dobson's at the same date. He has stated that he is satisfied that since the emergence of this problem in 1983, the advice given by medical and scientific staff of the Department of Health to ministers has been both correct and timely, bearing in mind the state of knowledge at the time, and that there's been no negligence in relation to this advice. And CMO feels that Mr Dobson's submission to Secretary of State makes this point. So that's the CMO's position. And then...
and that was in response to one that I'd sent him after a discussion.
Yes, and indeed I've taken these out of chronological order, for which I apologise. So your earlier minute of the 5th of December is DHSC 0004365_015. So this is you to the CMO.
Yeah.
It refers to, I think, a conversation in paragraph 1 of the possible implications of one of the options being considered for our Secretary of State to use in tomorrow's discussion with the Chief Secretary. And then you say, whilst I appreciate this presents the best arguments for encouraging Treasury to cover settlement costs and could be used for ring-fencing this deal, it may be very difficult to present this line of argument in a way which does not damage the reputation of the professionals concerned. If there is said to be a risk of losing which is sufficient to justify a settlement, then either the case is weak because there was negligence or the judge and legal system biased, yet neither of these reasons are ones we could / should use. And then, I'm not proposing to read out the third paragraph, but if I can look at the fourth paragraph, what I sought this morning was reassurance that you were aware and content that this line of argument was being used and would be acting to minimise the impact on the reputation of those individuals who were most involved, Dr Harris, Dr Wolford and Dr Smithers, as well as yourself and the department, all past CSM members and haemophilia specialists. Now, I really wanted to ask you two matters arising out of those documents. The first was what might be thought to be a slightly curious suggestion that if the department lost the case, it could only be because the legal system was biased.
Well, that's me being hypothetical.
Or the judge.
Or the judge.
Or the judge, yes.
Yeah, or the judge. Yes, I think I talk about the judge rather than the legal system.
Well, I think you talk about both, in fact.
Do I? Oh, I'm
yes.
sorry.
Judge in the
legal
later
process.
minute, judge
Come
in
on,
legal
I'm
system.
non-lawyer.
I'm
to say this is very unusual for me to write to a chief medical officer in this format. And it's obvious I'd had a discussion with him, and he said put that in writing, so that he could then put on the record that he felt there had been no negligence. So I suspect that's what the sequence was.
It might be said you seem to have had a particular concern that there shouldn't be any criticism or damage to the reputation of individuals within the department.
Including the chief medical officer. Yeah, I'm not particularly concerned. I just don't want the department's case to be underplayed for the sake of, well, it's almost if we were being, my predecessors were being, and their reputations are being sacrificed for the sake of being able to screw money out of the Treasury. And it didn't feel to me that was an appropriate way to behave. It's under my moral compass. I felt uncomfortable with that. And I wanted to check the chief medical officer, who personally would have been implicated as well. Was he aware? Was he content with this approach?
If sorry, I should say there's one other document on the same theme, which,
So, I think I know the next one
just
as
for
well.
the sake of completeness, is 2 days prior to this one. I've taken it in completely reverse chronological order.
This is the late one.
DHSC 0046939_046. Yeah, DHSC 0046939_046. And this was you, 3rd of December, to Mr Dobson. I was horrified to see in your briefing for new ministers sent to Mr Waterhouse on the 27th of November, under paragraph 5(4), the suggestion that thought is being given to minimising the knock-on effect by giving emphasis to the possibility of losing the case. To do this would reflect badly on those like the haemophiliac directors and CMO, who you would then be suggesting might have been negligent after all. And then you go on to say, if a suggestion is to be developed, the full implications must be appreciated and be discussed with the professionals involved. Now, again, it could be said that these minutes suggest that you were convinced that these individuals, haemophilic clinicians, the department had done no wrong.
I was convinced there had not been negligence in the way that I understood it. I think these were experts in their field. They'd taken expert advice. They'd followed expert advice by the standards that I would understand in terms of clinical negligence. I didn't think they would have any issue.
And what was that?
And the Chief Medical Officer agreed with me.
What was that based on? Because it couldn't be based on your own knowledge, because you weren't there at the time. So had you seen material which showed and satisfied you that the decision-making had been everything that it should be? Or was it an assumption?
I hadn't gone back to review it, but that information that I had seen that would have passed my desk would have been entirely consistent with that line. But also, I did know many of the individuals involved by that time, and they were all honourable people, mostly, I'd say honourable men, unfortunately mostly men, who clearly had the interests of patients at heart, and I also understand the decision-making process. I couldn't have seen how anything other than that decision would have come out. So it was entirely consistent with my seeing how the department operated, how those individuals operated, what drove them to their decision-making, as well as my understanding of what clinical negligence or negligence was about.
If we look at MHRA 0017681. So this is an earlier submission, a rather earlier submission, June 1989, from Mr Dobson to MSH and the Minister of State for Health. And we can see you're one of a fairly long list of individuals copied into this submission. And we looked at this with Dr Raymond. It's an updating submission about what the position is with the litigation. Can we just go to page 3? And I just want to ask you about something that's said in paragraph 5. It's the last sentence. We believe that the government has a fair chance of successfully defending its role in the court actions, given that at every stage it has acted as swiftly as possible to minimise the risk of infecting haemophiliacs with AIDS in the light of the best expert opinion available at the time. Now, just first of all, in general terms, would you accept this?
Yes.
That there might be it might be open to the department to be confident of the prospects of success in a case because there are legal arguments, legal hurdles, whether there's a duty of care, difficulty in establishing negligence as such, and so on. There might be all sorts of legal reasons why a claim might fail. This last part of the sentence seems to go rather further than that and actually put forward a positive narrative to ministers, a positive statement that the department acted as swiftly as possible to minimise risk in light of the best expert opinion available at the time. Would you accept that in order to put forward that positive narrative, there would need to have been some form of assessment, investigation, inquiry into what it was the department had done, what evidence and advice had been available to it?
You say investigation, I don't know whether the comments from those who had been involved at the time would have been regarded as sufficient. I don't know, if you look at the copy list, was that Dr. Smithies on the copy list? And the Chief Medical Officer clearly was.
If we just go back to the first page.
So several of the people who may have been involved at the time were there. Was it Dr. Harris, of course?
Yes, Dr. Walford, although her role by this time was
but I mean, Dr. Harris would have been the lead person, I think. So if he felt that wasn't right, he would have said so, but he could have been really the person someone would have checked up with, was that really true? And I think he would have been uncomfortable if it had been economical with the truth.
But is this right? You don't know what the factual basis for that confident assertion was?
When you say factual basis, I mean, I didn't have time to go back through all the historical records that were there when I started in AIDS.
Can I then ask you next about a slightly curious document we looked at with Dr. Raymond? It's MHRA 001764. If we go to the next page, first of all, please, Lawrence, we can just...
Oh, this one.
Yeah, we can just see the date, I think, on the next page. So 26th of January 1990.
Yes.
And then if we go back to the first page, it looks as though it's a record possibly taken by someone within the solicitors department.
Yeah.
It says, I attended the meeting with Dr. Raymond, Mr. Canavan and Mr. Brand, which we discussed who might be approached to give evidence on the department's behalf. Yeah. Then there's a reference to CMO letters. If we go further down the page, bottom of the page, it says, as regards communicable diseases generally, Hilary Pickles was the doctor involved. Now, before I look at the next sentence...
That's not right.
No.
This is generally not a very well-informed minute, it seems.
And then the role of the department generally, so far as communicable diseases is concerned, is that we do not indicate what treatment we should carry out. We would keep doctors informed and act as a clearinghouse, but no more. Are you able to cast any further light on what that
I don't know. I think it's just a curious way of putting it. I mean, we don't indicate what treatment should be carried out for any disease in particular. And as for Margaret Smith, the medical personnel officer, what a peculiar suggestion. No.
And in any event, you were not at the material time in relation to the events under investigation by in the litigation. You were not involved with communicable diseases. Is that right?
I was never involved with communicable diseases in general. Basically, I had AIDS, and then the blood side with a bit of BSE thrown in.
And then, in relation to another document from the haemophilia litigation, DHSC 0046958023, please. And Dr. Pickles, you'll appreciate some of these documents that have been identified where I've been asked to ask questions just to try and help illuminate what your involvement is or what was meant in particular documents. And this is an example of that. So this is the 20th of February 1990, you to Dr. Raymond. And it says this, I've discussed your minute of the 16th of February with Dr. Jones. We're happy for you to continue offering advice, including on the papers mentioned in the statements of claim to departmental colleagues and counsel. You should not be drawn into signing affidavits that would find their way to the judge or plaintiffs. If there are small inconsistencies in your advice and that of expert witnesses, there should be simple explanations that will not lead to any embarrassment. It's that those last two sentences rather than the first two that I wanted to ask you about.
In the first paragraph.
Yes. Why were you concerned that Dr. Raymond shouldn't be signing affidavits that would find their way to the judge or plaintiff?
I discussed it with Dr. Jones, who had previously been in the medicines division and so had been familiar with litigation. So in effect, I'm relaying his advice. And just generally, I think, what was it? He was providing advice, internal quality control and advice to our own solicitors, but was not, in effect, an expert witness in his own right. And I think that was saying he shouldn't be signing affidavits. He was there collating and supporting evidence, and if, in the end, I don't know if affidavits had to be signed, it would probably have, to be honest, done at a more senior level for the department as a whole. And in terms of the simple explanations, well, I've seen some of the comments he made in terms of expert witnesses, and some were simple little factual errors, like the wrong year being quoted or whatever, and that's fine, that's internal quality control. But, yeah, basically, we wouldn't expect an expert witness would be an expert, and Andre Raymond was, in fact, he had expertise, but he was not an expert witness.
And then DHSC 0004523_137. This is another document about Dr. Raymond's role. So this is 12th of Feb 91, you to Mr. Dobson. And then you're replying in Dr. Raymond's absence. The problem over workload on a case-by-case analysis is whether they are going to be happy to accept Dr. Raymond's judgment over likely negligence. He will have more experience in this than anyone the HAs will consult, and in many ways he's done much of this work already. But if they challenge him, and it's thought important we do have mutually agreed view at this level of detail, then we may have difficulty in releasing him for the necessary time.
It's slightly obscure, to be honest, but it was to do with his workload, I suspect.
And that I understand. Was it then the position that you were happy, the department was happy, that Dr. Raymond would be making judgments over whether negligence had taken place in individual cases?
Well, I'm not sure he is making judgments about negligence. I think he described yesterday how he was looking at, because of his clinical background, he was able to look at the clinical notes and be able to document various events and dates and times and so on. He would have a preliminary view about negligence, but when I suggest whether the health authorities would be happy to accept that, then there would clearly be a whole lot that could be eliminated, and a whole lot which would need more detailed discussions with them. Can I take this opportunity to say a bit about Dr. Raymond? Because I've noticed the evidence and watched with interest the last couple of days, and I just want to put on record that I found him a very dedicated and conscientious colleague, and I think he's had some unfair criticism. I was very content with the work that he did for me. I did not at any time receive any complaints from any of the people that he did work for, and I think some of the targeting he's had has been completely misplaced.
One final document in relation to the HIV litigation, Dr. Pickles, it's DHSC 00469580_007. Maybe a bit of a stretch for you to remember a meeting in March 1990, but I've been asked to see whether you are able to offer any more information about this.
I think I can.
Oh, good. Well, it's Dr. Raymond to Dr. Rubery, 2nd of March 1990, copy to you and Mr. Canavan. And it says, Dr. Pickles mentioned to me that at her meeting with you yesterday, you'd expressed some anxieties about the classification of documents that could be discovered in this litigation. And the question is really whether you can cast any further light about what those anxieties were.
I'm not sure he's right about this litigation. I think Dr. Rubery's concern, putting together the fact she talked about a select committee, and because of the timing, who she was, this was the salmonella and eggs issue. which I think was before the Select Committee, and Dr. Ruber had been heavily involved in that. And I'm assuming that's what she's concerned about, the advice that she'd given to ministers. But I'm reading that now, I can't remember, but it really makes sense because the Select Committee is what it was really about.
And then could we turn, then leaving aside now, leaving behind the HIV haemophilia litigation, we turn to some views you expressed about compensation for blood transfusion and organ recipients. I think there's more than one document, but I think we only need look at one for the purposes of the discussion. DHSC 000 3960 underscore 009. Now, this is a minute from you to Dr. Lewis.
Yes.
So that's essentially to the CMO, I think, is that right?
Yes.
20th of July 1988, and we can see a number of people copied in, including Dr. Moore. Compensation for blood transfusion and organ recipients infected with HIV. Just before we look at this, it became apparent during the evidence of Dr. Moore, and indeed from other material that the inquiries looked at, that the possibility of a scheme of financial assistance for those infected with HIV through transfusion or organ donation was under consideration in 1988, but then essentially fell by the wayside, or there was no decision to go with such a scheme until it then came up again following the conclusion, or around the time of the conclusion, of the HIV haemophilia litigation, and eventually a scheme was set up in 1992. So I'm hoping that you may be able to help us and understand why the issue or the idea wasn't taken any further in 1988. And you set out your views here, and there are views to, I think perhaps a similar effect from Mr. Heppel, and I'll just give the reference to that for the benefit of the transcript. I'm not going to go to it. And it's DHSC 0003960 underscore 005. Your views here, if we pick it up, fifth line, the first paragraph, the purpose of this minute is to explain my concerns to CMO, as I'm sure ministers will want to discuss this with him. I've discussed the problem briefly with Dr. Harris, and he suggested I should write this way. And then, first of all, in paragraph 2, you say there are logical inconsistencies in any extension of the scheme. Ministers took care when the haemophiliac scheme was announced to say this was not compensation for damage caused by NHS treatment, but a recognition of the special hardship of haemophilia, which were compounded by HIV infection. Many other HIV patients have the same expenses as transfusion recipients. Restricting eligibility to those infected by blood received in the UK looks very much like compensation for damage caused, raising the issues of compensation for other blood-acquired infections like the much commoner hepatitis, or complications more generally. Any restriction to AIDS cases only, whilst avoiding some of the problems of identifying those who might be eligible, would be inconsistent with the response to haemophiliacs and ignores the significant non-AIDS HIV morbidity and mortality. Experience with infected haemophiliacs suggests that ex gratia payments of this sort do not appear to lessen the chance of litigation. It's reasonable also to ask who is next. Why should infected healthcare workers be excluded? The babies of infected mothers, the faithful wives of bisexuals, and all the other innocent victims. And then over the page, you set out your view that you believe an extended scheme would be damaging to the transfusion service, as well as having serious practical problems. And I want to go through each of these and just ask you a little more about them. You say, first of all, confidence in the safety of the blood supply would be undermined. Patients will be reminded that even now the blood supply is not free of infection. Why did you think that providing financial support to those who had been infected would undermine confidence in the safety of the blood supply, given you could now say, well, we've got testing for HTLV3?
Yeah, because the way media messages get misinterpreted, and I think our experience in the AIDS unit was that anything about linking AIDS and blood would lead to a negative impact, and some potentially very unhelpful media comments that would amplify false concerns that people might have. It isn't logical, I mean, you're quite right. People should have been reassured. I think our experience is that linking the two together would not necessarily have positive headlines in some of the least helpful tabloid press.
B, increased worry about HIV and blood with adverse effect blood donors. Is that the same point, essentially?
Yeah, it's more or less it's the same point.
C, no established route for contacting genuine claimants. Hospitals are said to keep poor records, etc. Now, that was actually dealt with when the scheme was established by the sending of a CMO letter, I think, to all consultants and all general practitioners, and doesn't appear to have been a problem, although there were obviously individual cases.
You don't know those that didn't come forward, of course.
Validating, and then D is validating claims would be difficult, would absorb scarce resources. Not clear who would have responsibility for this. But as it happens, it was, I think, ultimately Dr. Raymond and then an independent panel. American experience suggests there could be many false claims. Our records are unlikely to be always good enough to allow the linking of recipients with specific donors. Now, that might obviously be right, but would that be a reason to refuse assistance to those where the link was perfectly well established on the records?
In a way, that's a slightly redundant and unnecessary comment if the rest had gone was accurate. But if I think if there'd been somebody who'd had multiple risk factors, then you would have need to be able to link the recipient with the donor. So if a homosexual man with multiple partners had also had a blood transfusion, then you couldn't just give him the benefit of the doubt. You'd presumably have to have some other way of checking.
And then E was numbers infected through blood in the UK are small but still increasing. Why would it be increasing given that HTLV3 screening had been in effect since 85?
Because I think we still talk about 1 in a million chance of receiving infection through blood transfusion. So, alas, it hadn't completely ceased.
But the numbers there would have been
small, but they're still increasing. It isn't a finite number and we put to bed. And also there was an issue about people who had infection overseas, UK people infected overseas.
And then you set out your belief that a general HIV compensation scheme would be totally opposed by the transfusion service. They have enough difficulties already. Well, in the AIDS unit, I argued against any move that might be taken as treating innocent victims differently from the rest. And then you refer in paragraph 6 to those arguments being sufficient to persuade HA. Who is HA?
Well, it's the Cabinet AIDS Committee.
To restrict compensation to haemophiliacs when this was discussed last year. Now, it's clear from this that you were firmly opposed to the idea of providing financial support to those infected through transfusion.
Can I say it was not just me? If you notice my witness statement, I said this was written in collusion with my administrative colleagues. And this is a very interesting example of the parallel hierarchies at work, because my administrative colleagues had been instructed to do this. They didn't feel they could get a workable scheme. They didn't think it was right. And so I then probably drafted that with them. I said I'd spoken to Dr. Harris, but actually I've spoken much more closely with some of my other colleagues. I prepared a separate route up to the Chief Medical Officer, and Strawn Heppel was arranged to put in his 2 penneth as well in that process.
Yes, and the minute from Strawn Heppel to the Minister of State for Health is the reference I read out a few minutes ago.
Why did we
at the same time
feel this strongly? I think throughout we've had real difficulties with this ring fence, trying as loyal civil servants to follow ministers' wishes, but if they come up with something that actually seems to us as insecure, difficult and hard to argue, the haemophiliacs, we were able to make an argument around there to satisfy what was needed. This group, much, much more difficult. And there was something else I didn't say, and I've looked, I haven't found it in writing, so I hadn't put it in my statement. But I think one of the objections that would have come up from certainly me, from my AIDS experience and potentially the AIDS unit as well, is that because of the awful stigma there was associated with HIV and AIDS, part of our action was to try to normalise infection with with AIDS to say it really was no different from any other communicable disease with very limited ways of transmission. And something like this was actually saying, but AIDS is special. And of course, AIDS isn't that special, or shouldn't be treated as special. And I'm afraid I haven't found a record the way we wrote that down, but that was part of the thinking as to why the AIDS unit was so firmly against this, because it ran counter to everything else they were trying to do to help people who had been infected.
Is it right to understand then that you didn't see any particular significance should be attached to the fact that this was a cohort of individuals, I mean, not in the sense of being an easily identifiable group, but this was a group or class of people infected directly as a result of NHS treatment? That didn't seem to you to make a difference?
Well, I mean, this is the problem with the ring fence, isn't it? Because there are lots of other people who'd been damaged as a result of NHS treatment. And I think the position up till then had been, if it had been like with the vaccine damage cases, the benefit had not just of the treatment, not been just for the individual, for the population as a whole. There was a different case for providing some form of compensation. This is, it was, I would say, who next? And I think it was the sympathy we had with everybody else who'd been damaged with, as a result of NHS treatment, non-negligent NHS treatment, of which there were very large numbers. And one of the reasons I felt quite strongly about it as a clinical pharmacologist, I had been aware of the adverse effects of lots of drugs. And at this time, about 5% of emergency admissions to hospital were as a consequence of adverse events from medication. So it's, it wasn't a trivial matter. There was a lot of it out there. And of course, enormous sympathy for those who were infected, but actually also with people who'd suffered from other illness, other treatment on the NHS.
And looking back, do you think it was perhaps part of your approach, your reasoning, and the view shared by Mr. Heppel and others may have been affected by this belief that we explored a few minutes ago, that the department had done nothing wrong, or that the NHS had done nothing wrong?
I think if we'd thought that the department had been clearly negligent, then that we wouldn't have tried arguing in this sort of way. It sort of. I don't think it really came. I don't think I ever had a thought that the department had been fundamentally faulty in what it had done in the past, to be honest.
And would it follow?
So it wasn't part of my thinking at the time.
Do you think, again, really just drawing on your experience of more generally within the department, that had the department leave aside negligence per se, but had the department
screwed up somehow,
having investigated, looked at it, soul searched, whatever, decided that there had been things that had not been done as well as they should have been, or things that had been done badly or too slowly, do you think that might have made a difference to the thinking?
I think it clearly would have done, yeah. And now you're going to try and ask me for examples when the department's fessed up for screwing things up, and I can't think of anything. Obviously not by me, but...
So I'm sorry, I had lost track of the time, and I'm going to move on to something different now, so perhaps we could take the lunch break.
Yes, well, we'll meet again at 2:10. 2:10.